And so we continue for the last segment on how to release an API with developers in mind with Anna and Gaël from Amadeus. Hello, Anna and Gaël. How are you?
Hello.
Hello, hello. All great, thanks.
Great.
Perfect. Yeah. So you have your full 25 minutes, and really looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you. So, when I joined Amadeus a few years ago, one of my first tasks was to build a flight booking application as a demo using our APIs. And at the beginning, I thought that to ask my manager what technologies we should use for this app, and he said, use any technologies that you feel comfortable with. And I thought, okay, this is not going to be super complicated. However, my excitement didn't last for long. Even though I was able to access the OpenAPI specification and find all the documentation, the Swagger, still I wasn't sure which APIs I had to use for my use case. That's why I got in touch with Gaël, who had always been an expert in our APIs, in order to help me solve my doubts.
So at first, I was really happy to be able to share all the insight about my product with the customer team. But rapidly, I grew concerned about the experience I was delivering to my user. To give you a bit of context, we are working for Amadeus. Amadeus is the leading technology provider in the travel industry. And within Amadeus, we are working for Amadeus for developers. Our mission is to connect the innovation ecosystem to the travel industry. And basically, we're creating REST JSON API, completely open and easy to use for anyone that want to contribute into creating a better travel experience. So actually, this little use cases that Anna told, this little story that Anna mentioned, was the starting point of our collaboration. Over the year, we have greatly improved the deliverable we are delivering to our user. And today, we are going to share with you some of our insights. You're going to learn what is important to pay attention during an API release, why is it important, and how you can make a difference. So my name is Gaël Imperial. I'm API product manager, and I have with me Anna Tsolakou, who is developer advocate. Without further introduction, let's move to what are the basics of an API release. And when you talk about API, the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, API documentation. The documentation is the very first thing that your API will see. And as we said, first impression matter. So I have a few tips for you that will help you make a difference in that matter. And the first one is quite obvious, but as much as possible, try your documentation in the same tool as your user will do. Now, more and more, the tool that you're using to design your API is completely different than the one that you're using for your user. And that can lead to some discrepancy in the markdown or even in the declaration of some models. So it takes just 1 minute to double check. Don't forget to do that. Another tip is to use tags. Tags allow you to regroup endpoints that are working together, either on the same resource or in the same flow. You can really use them to create a unique experience for your user and to guide him through the easiest path for him to learn about your API. Another tip is to add working example. Since OpenAPI version 3, you can add several examples for all your queries and your replies. Please abuse this feature. This is really helpful to reduce the time for the first API call. Developers love to shoot the API before even reading the documentation. Plus, those examples can be used later during the application development as mockup. And finally, last tip, if you plan to release several API, as we usually do, try to be consistent. Try to be consistent in the way you're handling your error, in the way you're creating your model and your parameter. The key here is to create a familiar environment so that the time that your user is investing in learning one API is actually investing it to learn all your product. To illustrate all of that, for instance, in Amadeus, we have a global governance that is defining every resources, the model of every resources, the way we are handling error and things like that, everything commonly for the company. Then every team is free to build the APIs and their product based on these little bricks. And if you look at our open program, Amadeus for Developer, you can go to developer.amadeus.com and you will see all our documentation with working example, and you can shoot everything directly from the portal without even having one line of code. Now that we have a good documentation, usually the next step to release an API is to think about the commercials. Here, I won't talk much about private API, because in this case, you're negotiating everything with your user, with your customer. But I will talk about open API. And for open API, the key is to have an offer that is attractive enough to basically attract a lot of users, because what you want is people to use your API so that they can maybe use it a lot, create product, and move in your plan to become really pro, or in this case, like ultra customer, right? But the real challenge is also to have enough to attract enough people to do that, but not too much so that it is impacting your production environment, and even worse, your top customer experience. And so for that, again, I have a few tips. The first one is take time to choose your API name. Quite often, people choose a name that makes sense with what the API does. But I will recommend you to also consider what your users are looking for and how they will use the API. To give you an illustration of that, a few years ago, when COVID raised, there was plenty of COVID API. With this name, it is pretty clear that you can find some COVID updates. And as people from the travel industry, at some point, we also had to offer this kind of services to our users, travelers, and travel agencies, because they were, of course, really interested by the evolution of COVID. And so we did our API. Now, can you imagine what would have happened if we choose to name this API COVID API as the others? First, the person that would have looked at it on Google would have been flooded by all the news websites that were giving updates about COVID. Then our API would have been completely lost in the mass of other COVID API. In the end, what we should do is focus on what our customers were looking for. And at that time, they were more concerned about is it safe to travel to this place, or is there any restriction like lockdown and things like that to move and travel to these places? And we choose to name the API travel restrictions. While you will agree with me that the name is not really clear about the content, COVID information, it was answering exactly what our users were looking for. And that really helped us to drive not any traffic, not any user, but just the user that were really interested, where our products were exactly answering their need. And that was the most likely to also move along and work with our company. And then my second tip for this part is, when you are in doubt, always go for the worst option for your customer. I know it sounds weird, but let me give you an example again. Let's say for your basic option, you're hesitating between two. If you take the lower price, of course, it is really interesting for your customer and they will be really happy. But a few months later, you realize that you have misevaluated your running cost and you need to increase the price. In this case, the experience is terrible. If you went for the other way around, actually, so going for the highest price and then potentially getting lower, actually going for the biggest price allow you to have some flexibility. You can adapt with the market, but you can also manage if there is anything not planned. Now that we have some prices on top of our documentation, the only thing that we miss is to really release it. And for that, I won't say much about this part because API today, there is plenty of tools that are doing API management that are really, really efficient and really good and easy to use. But again, I will give you one tip that we are using as well. Quite often when we talk about releasing an API, we think about releasing the API in production. You may also want to consider giving access to kind of a test environment, or at least a pre-production environment to your user. Let me explain. The goal here would be to have all your to create kind of a discovery offer on top of your starting offer. All your users could be connected to this pre-production environment or test environment that is much more easy to maintain and still not really plugged to the production. So not impacting your production environment, your production resources, and your production user. This is something that we are using at Amadeus for developer. When you're connecting and creating an account for the first time, we'll give you a free access in test. You can shoot everything. You will have, in this case, past data. And only if you're really happy about the way the API is working, you can even build your application directly in test. And only when you're happy about the result, then you can move in production and access the live data and the live performance of the production environment. So we went through all the basic steps of releasing an API, creating a good documentation, defining the commercials, and releasing it into the internet. Now, do you think we can do better than that? Anna, can you do better?
I think we can definitely do better. And let's see how we can do better. Now, Gaël has already explained you and given you some best practices around the API release. So you have just released a new API. However, how will developers find out about the new API? And the point that I would like to talk about now is the communication. When it comes to communication, the first thing that you want to consider is where we're going to do this communication about the API release. The most straightforward one is the developer portal, I would say. You can update your change log there, you can add some banners, and also you can build some blog articles in order to announce the new API. Also, you can build some newsletters that you're going to send to your registered users. Of course, you can as well do some communication through the social media that you are using, such as LinkedIn and Twitter. And apart from that, something that we do at Amadeus for Developers is we have a developer community on Discord. So in this case, we make sure that every time we have a new API, we announce it there. And finally, if you go to an event and, for example, you have a booth, maybe you can discuss with people that you meet there about the new API and its features. Or if you organize a hackathon, maybe you can give some challenges to the attendees that would maybe have to use this specific API to come up with a solution. And here I would like to highlight that when it comes to developer communities and events, also these two are very great ways for you to get quick feedback on your API. And now let's see some best practices. The first thing that is very important is to consider your target audience. Is your target audience a developer, or maybe it's going to be a more business-oriented person that maybe later on will pass some information to the developers? So make sure that you know who is your target audience in order to make the right message. Apart from that, the time of the year as well is important. For example, maybe during Christmas, developers might not check their email. So if you send out a newsletter, maybe it won't be as read as much as other times of the year. And it's crucial to do a planning. I'm sure most of you are very busy with many things. So if you don't plan the communication beforehand, most probably you won't make time for that when the moment comes. And don't think that you are alone on that. Don't be worried about that. For example, I'm a developer. I don't know much about marketing. That's why I make sure I collaborate with the marketing team of Amadeus. And also consistency is a key. Everyone loves consistency, so your users are going to appreciate it, and also you're going to have a smooth communication with your colleagues. So now that developers have found out about the new API that you just released, how will developers know about what they can do with the API? So the next step is building some developer guides. First, I would like to highlight guides that are for technical audience and technical related, I would say. What you can do is you can build some tutorials based on use cases. Gaël earlier explained how important it is to give a good name to your API. However, you can go even further. It gives much more insights and much more information to the user when they read the tutorial that says, for example, how to build a flight booking app or how you can make a payment. And inside, within these tutorials, they will be able to discover which APIs they have to use. But it's crucial to make it as simple as possible for them. That's why we strongly believe that it's good to build tutorials based on use cases and not based on the API names. Then you have to think about the proficiency levels of developers. Some of them maybe are junior developers, some of them are more senior. So make sure that you have some content that covers all the levels. And every time you build some developer guides, don't just publish them and then forget about them. You're going to receive a lot of questions during the life cycle of an API about your API or maybe things that are not clear enough. So you always have to go back and update it. And finally, as an advice, best practice is to make your developer guides open source. If they're open source, developers might contribute to them and also they will create some issues and pull requests directly to them. So now that we cover the technical guides, another part of guides that you can build are industry related. And this can be very useful for new players in the industry that they don't know much about it, but they want to explore it and build some applications. If you provide them some educational content about your industry, they're going to come up with more ideas and also definitely they're going to build better services for the users. And finally, by educating them, you will be able to have a common language with your customer. So now that we saw that developers can find out what they can do with your API, with some developer guides, how will developers be able to make their first API call in their own programming environment? So at this point, I would like to talk to you about SDKs. Thanks to the SDKs, developers will be able to access all the APIs of your catalog in an easy way and consistent as well. Another thing that you can do is with SDKs to help the authorization process. For example, at Amadeus for developers, you need to generate an access token with your API key and the API secret. To generate it is pretty easy and straightforward, but when you want to refresh the access token, which expires every 30 minutes, the developer will have to build some logic for that. So thanks to the SDKs, we make this authorization process very simple for developers, and we are the ones taking care of all the low-level details. Of course, it can be very useful for them to debug in when you give some error handling, and finally to build some code examples on top of your SDKs that developers will have to copy and paste directly in their application. Now, some best practices that I would like to share with you are the following. I would say again, make your SDKs open source. Developers love open source technologies. I also love open source, and it's a way to build trust with your community. So developers not only will like to maybe contribute to that, but also they will feel trust towards the product that they're using. Another thing to consider is the technology. Which technologies, which programming languages you want to support for your SDKs. For that, maybe you can do some analysis to see what are the top programming languages that are being used, or maybe you can do some analysis of the logs that you get in your backend to know what languages developers are using for your API. And I know most probably you will want to give as many technologies as possible for the SDKs, but from experience, I would like to say here that you need to think a lot about the knowledge that your team has and the resources, because every time you release a new API, you will have to update it. Every time there is a bug, you will have to fix it. And also, of course, your team might not know many programming languages, so you have to be very cautious about it. And finally, it's very important to have a high quality SDK that is well documented and well tested. So at this point, we saw how you can go better, how you can do better after the API release. So we talked about communicating the API that you released, then provide some developer guides so developers will know what they can do, and also giving them some SDKs to make the first API calls. Gaël, do you think we can do more? Do you think we can do better?
Definitely, Anna. Thanks to everything we have saw until now, we have tremendously reduced the time for the first API call for our user. And we have also greatly increased his learning curve. So now, for sure, what will come is a lot more complex and advanced question from your user. And one way to go beyond is to continue making it easier for him. And you can make it easier by creating more advanced guides or even video tutorial for all the various parameters that your API is having, or how they're combining each other, how we can create something bigger. Another way to make it easier is also in helping him see how we can introduce this API inside his application. Anna, can you tell us more for that?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Something that you could do could be to build some plugins that developers will be able to integrate them in their applications, maybe without having to write any code, or some widgets that are easy to integrate and customize. And the key here is to make something easy for the developer. So if they have to update the code, to customize it, make sure that it's easy to be done and that your code is clean.
Another way to go beyond is by inspiring the developer. Quite often when you release an API, you have to choose one specific use case that you're highlighting. But your resource is much more richer than what you're showing. And one way to inspire the developer is by creating visual like there in Postman. You have in one shot everything that your resource, your API can do. This is really helpful to convince people like me, marketing, also to show the whole possibility of the API, maybe unlocking several use cases for the developer. Another way to inspire him is by showing how your API work with the rest of your ecosystem or even beyond. Anna, can you tell us?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
For that, you can build some web or mobile applications, small prototypes or demo apps that combine different APIs of your catalog, but even APIs of partners that you have or third-party APIs that you think are useful. Because if you think of a real scenario of a real company, developers not only are going to use your API, but most probably they're going to use different types of providers for their solution. That's why we think it's very important to inspire them to build this type of applications. And again, here I would suggest, it's the third time I say it, but make also these prototypes open source so developers not only will be inspired, but also they will be able to build their own solutions on top of them without having to start from scratch.
Thank you, Anna. So to wrap it up, we give you some tips on the very basic of how to do an API release. If you can invest more time, it's really great to create some guides and tools for the developer. And finally, ultimately, something that will really make a difference is by inspiring the developer, help him build something that is much bigger than what he came for.
And we would really like to invite you to review your API release processes in order to find areas of improvement.
Thank you very much, Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Really, one quick question. What's the size of Amadeus community, developer community?
Today, our developer community on Discord has a bit more than 1,000 developers.
Wow, nice. Because Amadeus is not public facing, it's an API that provides other people. So yeah, it's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
We reached the time we had for the presentation, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
We've been following Amadeus over the last 4 or 5 years on their APIs, such improvements and such a leading forward. Now you are in the advanced part, so that's good.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Have a great day.